Halloween was coming and the night felt eerily perfect for ghost stories. My friends and I sat around a campfire, its glow flickering shadows onto our faces. Sarah, usually quiet during our story sessions, seemed hesitant but finally said, "I have a story. It's about my parents' first date. It's true." Her voice had a seriousness that silenced us all. Sarah's parents, Lisa and David, had met at a mutual friend's party. She was charming but reserved, and he was a bit of an adventurer. After a fun first date, David suggested they take a midnight hike in Provo Canyon. Though unusual, Lisa went along, figuring it'd be a memorable experience. They each drove to the canyon, parked their cars, and met at the trailhead. The night was pitch black, with no moonlight, only a stretch of stars overhead. They began the hike, David pointing out constellations to keep things light. Lisa laughed, but she was uneasy in the darkness, relying on his knowledge to guide her along the trail. After a while, David suddenly stopped. A prickling sensation crawled up his spine like eyes watching from the shadows. He brushed it off, not wanting to seem paranoid. "It's nothing," he murmured, continuing forward, but the feeling wouldn't leave him. It clung to him, a persistent dread gnawing at his gut. "Are you okay?" Lisa asked, sensing his discomfort. "Yeah, just thought I heard something," he replied, keeping his tone casual. They passed under a thick cluster of trees where the starlight was swallowed by branches that intertwined like skeletal fingers. David hesitated, feeling something like a magnetic pull to keep moving forward, even as his instincts screamed at him to turn back. Lisa felt it too, the thick, choking sensation of being watched. She glanced at David, hoping he'd suggest they turn around, but curiosity overrode caution, and they pressed on, following the dark path ahead. Then David's foot struck something soft. He froze, his heart thundering. Whatever he'd stepped on wasn't a branch or a rock. A faint metallic smell lingered in the air, one he couldn't quite place. "Did you smell that?" he whispered. Lisa felt her stomach drop as she looked down, squinting into the darkness. She didn't answer, but her face was pale, her breathing shallow. Hands shaking, David fumbled for the tiny flashlight on his keychain. He switched it on and directed the weak beam toward the ground. His breath caught in his throat as the light fell on a sprawled figure, a human body, twisted unnaturally, limbs splayed at impossible angles. Lisa gasped, clasping her hand over her mouth. They stood there paralyzed, their minds struggling to process the horrific scene before them. David wanted to move, to pull her back, but he couldn't tear his eyes from the body. A sudden rustle in the trees shattered the silence. David's flashlight jerked up, illuminating a dark figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. The man's face was hidden, but his posture was predatory, his gaze cold and unfeeling. David's heart raced. He felt a chill run through him as he realized they weren't alone, and that whoever this was had likely been watching them for some time. Without a word, he grabbed Lisa's hand and ran, their feet pounding against the trail as they sprinted back toward their cars. David didn't dare look back, too terrified of what he might see. The only thought in his mind was escape. They reached the trailhead, breathless and panicked. Neither of them spoke as they scrambled into their cars, peeling out of the parking lot and speeding down the canyon road. The silence was thick, both of them too shaken to say anything, each lost in their own terror. Years passed, and David and Lisa married. They tried to forget about that night, to leave the memory buried in the dark recesses of the canyon. But sometimes, when David closed his eyes at night, he could still feel that presence watching him, waiting in the shadows. One evening, they were watching the news when a story came on that froze them in place. The news anchor was interviewing a serial killer who had confessed to multiple murders across the country. In the interview, he spoke with chilling calmness about his victims and his methods, describing the places he had left their bodies. Then, the interviewer asked if he'd ever come close to being caught. A smile played on the killer's lips as he replied, "There was one time. I'd just finished with a girl in Provo Canyon. I was dragging her off the trail when I heard footsteps. I hid in the trees and watched as a couple walked right up to her. The guy even stepped on her, and then they just left." David and Lisa sat frozen, the weight of that night crashing over them. They'd been within inches of the killer, inches from death. For a long time, they didn't speak. The memory of that night had resurfaced with terrifying clarity, and as they sat there, they realized just how close they'd come to a fate far darker than they'd ever imagined. David often found himself thinking about that night, about the body on the trail, the figure in the shadows. And every time he did, he felt that same chilling fear, the fear that had saved them, urging them away from the darkness lurking in Provo Canyon. When I was 10 years old, I lived in Mesa, Arizona, in a neighborhood that had its fair share of trouble. My childhood innocence shielded me from many dangers, but that night would open my eyes to a reality I had never considered. It was around 8:40 p.m. when I started walking home from my friend's house. The sun had set long before, leaving the streets shrouded in darkness. My mom always insisted I be home by 9, and I had learned to time my departures to ensure I wasn't late. The streets were familiar, just a couple of blocks, and I felt safe enough during the day. But as darkness fell, the world transformed. As I walked, the chirping of crickets filled the air, and I noticed a peculiar silence settling around me. That's when I heard a woman calling my name. "Hey, is that you? Your name?" I turned to see a woman approaching. She was someone I recognized, a friend of my mother's, but I didn't know her well. "Hi," I replied, smiling, trying to mask my unease. "What are you doing out here?" She stepped closer, urgency in her tone. "Your mom sent me to get you. There's been an emergency, and I need to take you home." Panic washed over me. "What kind of emergency? It's serious," she insisted. "We need to hurry. Your mom's in the hospital." I hesitated, feeling a knot form in my stomach. I was only a few minutes from home, and something about her demeanor felt off. "Can we call my mom first?" I asked, my instincts urging caution. "She can't talk right now. We have to go." Her tone sent alarm bells ringing in my head. My heart raced as doubt clouded my mind. Was my mom really in trouble? I wanted to trust her, but fear crept in. As we reached her car, I heard a distant shout. "Hey, where are you?" It was my mother's voice, echoing through the night. My heart dropped. "Mom," I called, turning back. "She's fine," the woman snapped. "Just get in." But I couldn't shake my fear. "No, I want to talk to her." I rushed toward my mother, who appeared just a few yards away, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "What's going on?" she gasped, her eyes darting between me and the woman. The woman stepped forward, ready to speak, but my mother cut her off. "I'll ask the questions here." The woman hesitated, and I felt the tension in the air thicken. I recounted what had happened, and my mother's face turned pale. "You were trying to take my son," she said, her voice filled with disbelief. The woman's husband, who had been silent until then, glanced nervously out the window. "Let's go, honey," he urged. And in that moment, I caught sight of something on the dashboard, a syringe, leaning ominously against the windshield. Panic surged through me. My mother, sensing the danger, reached for her purse, where she kept a small knife. But before she could act, the woman jumped into the car, and they sped away, leaving us standing in the darkness. "What just happened?" I asked, trembling. My mom pulled me into a tight hug, her body shaking as she whispered, "I almost lost you." The realization of how close I had come to danger hit me like a cold wave. After that night, my family cut ties with the woman and her husband. My stepdad filed a report with the police, recounting the events that unfolded. Months passed, and we received news that the man had been arrested for possessing child pornography. The police found restraints in his closet and containers of propofol. The most chilling detail, however, was that they discovered pictures of me saved on his computer, taken from my mother's Facebook profile. The truth was horrifying. I had been watched. The knowledge sunk deep into my bones, leaving me shaken. I rarely spoke about that night, even to my closest friends. The fear lingered in the corners of my mind, a constant reminder of the dangers that exist in the world. I often replayed the events, wondering what might have happened if my mom hadn't come looking for me. Years later, I asked her why she had felt compelled to search for me that night. She described the unsettling intuition that had struck her, a deep-rooted instinct that warned her something was wrong long before she knew I was in danger. Listening to her words sent shivers down my spine. It was as if a force had conspired to protect me. That realization brought both comfort and terror. I had been spared, and for reasons beyond my comprehension, I was still here. From that moment on, I learned to trust my instincts. I never ignored that inner voice again. My mother walked with me whenever I left the house, ensuring I stayed safe until I turned 13 and moved back in with my dad. Those late-night walks became a ritual, a connection forged from fear and a shared understanding of the lurking dangers in the world. To this day, I remember the chilling encounter that nearly changed my life forever. It serves as a reminder of how quickly things can spiral out of control. I carry the weight of that experience with me, a haunting echo of the fragility of safety. In a matter of seconds, my life could have taken a completely different turn, and I remain grateful for the bond that saved me that night. It's a lesson I will never forget, a reminder that sometimes our instincts can lead us away from danger, and that love and intuition can shield us in our darkest moments. Alex stared at the flickering neon sign of the gas station, the buzzing light casting eerie shadows across the lot. The clock above the register showed it was almost midnight, and the night shift was dragging on. He was alone, save for the occasional passing car and the faint sounds of the radio crackling in the background. Just a few more hours, he muttered to himself, wiping his brow. His co-worker, Anne, had gone on break, leaving him to manage the late-night shift. As he organized the snacks on the shelf, a chill crept into the air. He shivered, glancing at the security monitors that displayed the outside. The view was mostly dark, but a shadow moved just beyond the reach of the gas station's lights. He squinted, but nothing was there now. Must be the wind, he thought, shaking off the unease. The bell above the door chimed, and he jumped, heart racing. He turned to see Anne stepping inside, her face pale. "Did you see anything out there?" she asked, locking the door behind her. "Just shadows," he replied, trying to sound casual. "You know how it is out here." Anne glanced at the monitors. "It's not safe to be out after dark, you know the rules." Alex rolled his eyes. "Come on, the rules are just silly stories." Suddenly the screen flickered, and Alex froze. A figure emerged on the monitor, standing just outside the light. It was too dark to make out details, but he could feel its gaze through the screen, cold and heavy. "Anne," he whispered, pointing at the monitor. "Look!" Her eyes widened as she followed his gaze. "You need to lock the door now!" Panicking, Alex fumbled for the keys, finally managing to lock the door just as the lights flickered ominously. "What's happening?" he asked, glancing back at her. "Don't look at them!" she shouted, urgency lacing her voice. "We can't let them in!" "Who?" Alex demanded, feeling the tension rise. "Fred and his friends," she said, her face ghostly pale. A loud crash echoed from outside, sending chills down Alex's spine. The bell jingled violently as if someone were trying to force the door open. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he felt dread settle in his stomach. "We need to get to the storage room," Anne insisted, grabbing his wrist. "It's the only safe place until morning." Before Alex could argue, she dragged him to the back of the store. He glanced back at the monitors, where the figure now loomed just at the edge of the light, its eyes glowing faintly. They reached the storage room, and Anne slammed the door shut, locking it tight. The small space was cluttered with boxes and old supplies. "Stay quiet," she whispered. They huddled in the corner, the darkness pressing in around them. The door rattled, and the bell jingled again. Alex's heart raced as muffled whispers began to swirl around them. "Are they out there?" he asked, dread pooling in his stomach. "Yes," Anne replied, her voice trembling. "We just need to wait for dawn." As the minutes stretched on, the whispers intensified, a chorus of voices urging them to let them in. Alex held onto Anne's arm, feeling her tremors. Outside, chaos reigned, a cacophony of thuds and whispers clawing at their sanity. Then, the lights went out, plunging them into suffocating darkness. Alex's panic escalated. "What do we do?" he whispered, wishing for light. "Wait," Anne replied. "Just stay quiet and listen." The darkness was all-consuming, and Alex could hear his heartbeat echoing in his ears. The shadows felt alive, creeping closer, whispering threats he couldn't understand. Suddenly the lights flickered back on, illuminating the cramped room. Alex blinked, but the brightness didn't chase away the fear. He turned to Anne, who stared at the door, frozen. "Anne," he whispered, his voice thick with fear. "They're trying to get in," she said, eyes wide. The door rattled violently, and they heard heavy breathing on the other side. "Remember the rules!" Anne yelled suddenly. "We need to stay quiet!" Alex felt his resolve waver. "But they're right there!" The door rattled again, and they could hear something scratching at the wood. "This can't be happening!" Alex gasped. "We'll be fine," Anne insisted, though her voice quaked. "We just have to hold out." Then, without warning, the door burst open and a figure surged into the room. It was Fred, twisted, gaunt, and grotesque. Its skin stretched tight over its bones, and a wide grin split its face. Alex screamed as Anne lunged forward, slamming the door shut against the chaos outside. "We have to fight!" she shouted, adrenaline surging. "Fight!" Alex echoed, his voice high-pitched. "With what? Anything! The supplies, the tools!" she shouted, grabbing a mop. Desperately, Alex reached for a broomstick, gripping it tightly as they faced the door. The whispers grew louder, the shadows closing in, their cold breaths chilling the air. Just as they braced themselves, the lights flickered again, then went out completely. The room plunged into darkness, and they could hear Fred's heavy breathing outside, a sound that sent ice through Alex's veins. "Stay close," Anne hissed, and Alex nodded, feeling her fear mirrored in his own. Then a series of loud bangs erupted against the door. The wood shuddered under the force, and Alex felt despair wash over him. "This is it," he thought, the weight of their fate pressing down. "Remember the rules!" Anne yelled, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We need to stay quiet!" The banging continued, relentless and deafening, each thud a reminder of their fragile safety. Just when Alex thought it would break, the door splintered, and Fred pushed through, his dark figure blocking the faint light. "Get out!" Alex screamed, panic clawing at him. "Through the back!" Anne shouted, pointing toward a small exit in the storage room. With adrenaline surging, they sprinted toward the back door, shadows clawing at their heels. Alex twisted the handle and flung the door open, gasping at the chilly night air. They stumbled outside, the gas station still and ominous. Alex felt relief wash over him, but it was short-lived, as he turned to see Fred blocking their way to the car. "We're trapped!" he gasped, despair sinking in. "No, we can't give up!" Anne shouted, determination flooding her voice. "We just need to remember the rules!" In that moment, something ignited within Alex. He snatched a nearby rock, gripping it tightly. "On three!" he shouted, adrenaline pumping. "1, 2, 3!" They charged forward, swinging their makeshift weapons. The rock struck Fred's shoulder, and he screeched, a chilling sound that pierced the night. With Fred stumbling back, they seized the opportunity and dove into the car, slamming the doors shut behind them. Alex fumbled for the keys, hands shaking as he turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, and they sped away from the gas station, leaving the horrors behind. The sounds of chaos faded into the distance, but the shadows loomed in his mind. In the weeks that followed, Alex couldn't shake the memory of that night. He took a new job far from the gas station, yet fear lingered like a ghost at his back. One evening, as he drove past the familiar stretch of road, he glanced at the gas station. The flickering lights still danced in the darkness, and for a moment he thought he saw a figure standing outside, watching him. With a shiver he turned away, vowing never to return. The rules had saved him once, but he couldn't risk it again. He had escaped the shadows, but they would always linger, waiting for someone new to take the night shift.